Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of a high-level dialogue and symposium on BRICS. Yesterday, those of you who were here would probably agree with me that we had very interesting, very informative discussion with Ambassador Nhlapo. And today, again, we look forward to another very interesting, thought-provoking discussions. Let me also take this opportunity to welcome participants who are online. I see that they are ready. I believe that the mics should also have been tested because they are going to be very active today in terms of the engagement. Now, you'd recall that yesterday we were focusing more on a dialogue with Ambassador Nhlapo, who is still here on the podium with us. But today we're going to have a number of participants. And in fact, today's sessions are going to be broken into two. The first session is going to be on, session one on the Chinese perspectives on peace and diplomacy in Africa. And there we're going to have an introduction of a number of participants. And then we'll have the second session. The second session is going to be on Pan-African perspectives on peace and diplomacy in Africa. And after that second session, we are now going to have Prof. Prague coming back to give us an overview in terms of the future. What type of publications can we expect in as far as the outputs of this dialogue are concerned? And again, we look forward to a very interesting day, a very active participation of those who are online and those who are present in this room. I'll now hand over to Professor Kwesi to introduce the participants this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues, esteemed guests. Welcome again to day 2 of the proceedings. This is hopefully a more robust, yesterday was equally robust, if not overwhelming at times. But today will also be just as informative in terms of content, in terms of thought-provoking conversations, questions and answers. Let me not delay and let me get right to it. I'd like to introduce our online participants, guests, esteemed guests, and in no order of preference. Let me first introduce Dr. Li Wentao. Dr. Li Wentao is Executive Director of the Institute of African Studies, which is part of the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. Mr. Li is a member of the Chinese Association of African Studies and Chinese Society of African Historical Studies. Mr. Li earned the MA from the Department of International Relations of Nanjing University and is a PhD candidate at CICIR, which stands for Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. Mr. Li has engaged in African studies for over 10 years. He's visited about 30 African countries and attended just as many international conferences and exchanges. He focuses his main interests in Nigeria or on Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and countries in the Horn of Africa. He prefers to focus his studies on African politics, African peace and security studies, and relations with major powers, as in relations with China and other traditional donors and trilateral cooperation. Mr. Li Wentao is our esteemed guest, and he will be presenting first. I please welcome everybody, Dr. Li Wentao. I think he is the individual on the right of your screen, if you're facing us. Yes. Greetings, Dr. Li. Our second esteemed guest is the retired Ambassador Xu Zhan. Retired Ambassador Xu Zhan is, colleagues, let me just prepare my screen, is a veteran in the diplomatic service and corps of the Chinese government. His career begins in July 1977 as an assistant research fellow at the Institute for West Asian and African Studies, which is part of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is the premier research institution in China. In 1983, he was the second secretary at the Bureau of African Affairs, which was part of the International Department for the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. In 1986, he became the second secretary at the Chinese Embassy in Ethiopia, followed by a change in 1994 as a visiting professor at the Witwatersrand University, which is Wits University. And then he also became a visiting associate professor at George Mason University in the US. He, in 1988, became the deputy director of Bureau of African Affairs at the International Department for the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party of China. He became the deputy director for the Committee of Foreign Affairs for the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. In 1997, he was the Deputy Director and First Secretary within the Division of Research and Regional Organizations, which was part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China. He became the political counselor at the Chinese Embassy in Namibia and South Africa between 1999 and 2003. He was a counselor at the Department of African Affairs within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China between 2003 and 2005. He became the ambassador to Rwanda, Republic of Rwanda, and the ambassador to the Republic of, or State of Eritrea between 2006 and 2013. He was senior research fellow within the Institutes of African Studies at Zhejiang Normal University in China between 2013 and 2018. And now he's currently the senior research fellow and director within the Center of African Studies at the China Foundation for International Studies. Colleagues, this is a very experienced ambassador that we are humbled to know very well. Please give a warm welcome for Ambassador Xu Jian. On that note, I'd like to begin proceedings and shift responsibilities to my esteemed guest, Professor Charlotte du Toit.
Thank you very much, colleagues, participants, and especially our esteemed presenters. We are truly honored to have you here today, and in the spirit of the focus of this dialogue, we would like to have a very interactive and lively and robust discussion. So we're going to start off the discussion by allowing Dr. Ventao to share his thoughts on the Chinese perspective on peace and diplomacy in Africa. For each presenter, we're going to allow around about 15 minutes. I'm going to give you an indication when we are nearing the end of this of the time frame, because we would like to engage our members and our participants. We're on a fairly strict timeline here because we've got an hour for the session, which then will allow us a half an hour of questions and answers. I will address or deal with those, how we're going to deal with that after we've listened to the inputs and the comments of our esteemed presenters. So without any further ado, please, Dr. Ventao, the floor is yours.
For the invitation of University of South African. If my voice is okay? Okay, today my topic is China's view on China-African security cooperations. And Sino-African security cooperations has a long history. As earlier as the 1950s and the 1960s, when China provided military and security support to Algeria and Guinea. China was a very important external supporter and of the national liberation struggles of many African countries. China and many African countries shared the same ideologies and common international position. The purpose was to opposite colonialism, imperialism, and hegemonism. At that time, there were three main ways of Sino-African security cooperations. First, material support, including equipment, weapons. Second, personal training. And China invited some promising African freedom leaders to China, and these young people and young leaders learned military theory and experience of guerrilla and military technologies. From 1964 to 1979, China provide military training to more than 40 countries, send 6,400 military instructors and experts, and received more than 8,000 foreign military students. China also sent most of these and military students and from Africa, about 5,000, more than 5,000. So, and China also sent a large number of personnel to Africa to train the local fighters. As far as we know, and 3 former Mozambique presidents accept training from the Chinese military instructors. And third project for Sino-African cooperations is the cooperations in information intelligence. As far as we know, in that period, China was isolated by the West. So it is important for both China and Africa to share information. So, and from the perspective of the history, we can see that China-African security cooperation has laid the foundation for the traditional friendships between China and Africa. In the new area, Sino-African cooperation, security cooperation has made great progress. The areas of the security cooperation have become broader and more diversified. This includes peacekeeping. China is the largest contributor of troops to peacekeeping operations among the permanent members of UN Security Council. China has sent nearly 50,000 soldiers to participate in 25 UN peacekeeping missions, about 80% of which are deployed in Africa. In the area of conflict mediation, China set up a special envoy during the Darfur crisis and in 2007, then and becomes the special representative of China on African affairs. The Chinese representative on African affairs make contributions to African security through the sheltered diplomacy. For example, in Sudan and the South Sudan conflicts. In 2022, the Chinese government established a new post, the Special Envoy for the whole of African affairs. In the past few years, and we know that, the situation in the whole of Africa is really nervous. Chinese Special Envoy played a very active role to push the relevant parties to diffuse the tension, even invited the Eritrea to participate in the meeting with the IGAD. As far as we know, Eritrea doesn't usually attend the meetings where the IGAD representative is present. So, and China raised the outlook on peace and development in the whole of Africa, which is accepted by the regional countries. In maritime security, China keeps close cooperation with African countries. According to the UN Security Council resolutions, since 2008 to 2022, last year, the Chinese Navy has deployed 45 escort task force and in the Gulf of Aden and finished escort missions for nearly 7,000 ships. And this year, China, South Africa, and Russia hold joint navy and exercises. In addition, China has also carried out a lot of cooperations with Africa in personal exchanges, trainings, and technical support, and other aspects. What is especially mentioned is that Africa also given the formed support to China's national security. Reformed China's sovereignty issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang. African countries have firmly supported China on international occasions. As I cited above, in the new area, China-African security cooperation has made great progress. However, we must also see that the world is undergoing major changes unseen in a century. the world is more uncentered and coupled and with the impact of epidemic in the past few years and the Russian-Ukraine crisis. All of this will have a major impact on the security environment on the Sino-African corporations. And we can see that in the past few years, the security situation in Africa is worse. First, the regional conflicts increase evidently, especially the regional major power situations is in tension, and the Ethiopia fall into civil war, which is from the act of regional stability to a source of instability. Despite the Tigray signed the peace negotiations agreement and with the federal government, but and from my own observations, I think the prospects are not optimistic. At the same time, Ethiopia faces other security problems, like the conflict currently happened in Amhara region. Nigeria is troubled by the terrorism, organized crime, tribal conflict in the past few years. South Africa has also seen its worst social rights in the past 20 years. Second, and coup d'etat returns. The whole Sahel become the cool belt. From the west, you can see from the Guinea and to the east, Sudan. Currently, and the global spotlight now is on Niger. And now, whether Niger will become and will fall into a civil war, and nobody knows. And thirdly, terrorism is on the rise in Africa. Sahel region has the most terrorist organizations. It is also the region with the highest number of deaths from the violent terrorist attacks. Last but not least, the shadow of a new Cold War may once again loom over Africa. Some powers forced African countries to take sides. So facing current situations, China and Africa need to strengthen strategic operations in order to bring more stability and sanity to the world. This security cooperation is more necessary. Currently, Chinese security philosophy is guided by two security views. One, and we call it the holistic view of national security, which was reached by the 2014 at the first meeting of the National Security Commission of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee. The holistic view of national security is the most important thought to guide China's national security and international security corporations. Referring to the international security corporations, it emphasizes the common security and the harmony world. The other security view is the Global Security Initiative concept paper released in this year. This is China's latest thought and proposition and on international security issues. So I would like to talk about a few key points of the China's security philosophy, and which and related to the China-African and cooperation. The first, China upholds the principle of indivisible security. China has never presumed absolute security, opposite to building our own security on the insecurity of the other countries, advocating the indivisibility and between individual security and common security, between the security rights and the security obligations. There should be a balance, effective and sustainable security architectures, so as to realize the universal security and common security Second, security is at the service of development. China's security philosophy is to serve development, to make the country rich and strong, to let the people live in a better life. China's security operations in Africa is not intended to engage in any geopolitical game. Thirdly, China's security view is people-centered. With the progress of the Belt and Road Initiative,
Could you
a large number of
apologies.
okay.
Just right.
Okay, I got it. So a lot of number of Chinese enterprises and Chinese citizens have gone out at present, and among all the non-regional countries in Africa, China has the first number of companies, the first number of projects, the first number of citizens. The Chinese government and leaders are most concerned about the safety of Chinese citizens. Over the past 2 years, more than 1,000 Chinese citizens have been kidnapped in Africa. Currently in Niger, we still have 5,000 Chinese citizens there. This is also a very important reason why the Chinese government has strengthened security operations and with an African. So, yes, maybe I have, based on my research and thinking over the years, I have some suggestions. And because of the time limit, maybe I can leave the time and to have discussions and to maybe have more exchanges. So finally, I would like to thank you, the University of South African, for the invitation, and hope seminars will bring more contributions to the upcoming BRICS meetings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wen Tao, and thank you for the invitation. We are definitely going to take you up on this very thought-provoking and informative comments that you've made. And there will be more opportunity to address those in the follow-up answer and question session. Maybe then immediately ask Ambassador Xu Zhan to open to present his opening remarks to us. Thank you so much for the opportunity to listen to your experience and wisdom. Thanks.
Okay, and I'm trying to be very brave. And first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation of the organizers. And I've been retired for about 10 years, especially in the last few years. I could not go back to Africa, so I'm not quite sure about the information I get it is true or not. So I rather concentrate on my understanding of this, what Li Wentao said, this, what we call it, the global security initiative we put forward about 2 years ago. Actually, in the last 2 or 3 years, starting from 2021, China has successfully proposed.
Ambassador?
Yes.
Apologies for the interruption. Yeah. Could you kindly move in front of your camera so that we can... Thank you so much.
How about no?
That is perfect.
Is it all okay?
Yes,
okay.
You are completely in our sight now. Thank you so much.
It's okay.
Apologies for the interruption.
No, it's okay. And so, firstly, we try to propose the global development initiative. And then we find if without a security situation, we cannot have a sustainable development. So therefore, we have this global security initiative put forward in 2022. And this year, we have this global civilization initiative. The most closely related topic to today's seminar is the second one, the Global Security Initiative. To my understanding, faced with the current new international security situation, this initiative advocates a new way for the security that takes the dialogue over the confrontation, take partnership over the alliance, and a win-win cooperation over zero-sum rivals. So this GSI embodies the core tenets in the vision of a community with a shared future. And it has, maybe now so far, more than 90 countries and the regional organization have expressed their appreciation and support for this initiative. And also it has been included into more than 30 bilateral and multilateral negotiations among the China and other countries. So as Li Wentao just now said, in this year around February, the end of February, the foreign ministry released a GSI concept paper, and among its 20 priorities of priorities for cooperation, most of them involved with UN. However, there are some directly mentioned in Africa. For example, the fourth one includes supporting the implementation of the initiative of silencing the gangs in Africa by this agenda for 2063. And the eighth point is entirely on cooperation with African countries, the AU and the sub-regional organizations in Africa. So to my understanding, we have a few things try to introduce this new thinking. However, China wants to be a partner in resolving and ending local and regional conflicts by a few principles. First is to adhere to legitimacy and solve problems through appropriate means within the framework of the relative mechanisms such as the United Nations and the African Unions. While in Africa, these solutions, I think, should be started with African initiatives, with African ownership and African beneficiation, like this African-China Horn initiative, or what they call it, Horn of Africa Peace Conferences. And the second, security governance may be a gradually, a kind of a long process, especially in solving some complex things that have accumulated over the years. Otherwise, recklessly intervention in conflicts between the siblings or the cousins may lead to an awkward situation in the future. I think China has learned a lesson in 1960s and the 1970s. The first one is in then Congo Libreville, now it's the DRC. The second in the 1970s in the Nigeria. Because we did not know the situation in the local, so some of the statement was not very appropriate. And we should also address both the root cause of the counter-terrorism and other related or compounded issues. Thirdly, in the face of a complex situation where the traditional security and the non-traditional security questions are intertwined, I guess comprehensive governance is the best way to achieve, through a combination of a political, economic, social, and other means, to accurately and effectively solve the various problems. I don't think it is advisable to push everything onto geopolitics, and perhaps this way or this approach may achieve sustainable security. Fourthly, this new security concept emphasizes the creation of the local security by addressing development issues and improving the livelihood of the local people. I think only by achieving sustainable development for a country or for a region, as well as common development with external regions, can there be a sustainable common security for the world. Finally, African-China cooperation on security should keep the FOCAC, that is a forum of China-African cooperation. We have the principle of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared the benefits. So I think so far I can only, say these a few things. And thank you for your listening.
Thank you so much. I have to admit, Ambassador Tsang, that at this point, myself being an economist, the odd one out in the room, this what you've raised are music to my ears in terms of the focus on sustainable development as a foundational aspect of, or security being focused on sustainable development, and that being the foundation to livelihoods, etc. I cannot agree more. But let me not hijack the discussion. So if you will indulge me, colleagues, I think I would like to invite Ambassador Tlhapho, if he would like to maybe have a few introductory remarks and comments that he would like to share with us.
No, thank you very much. I would have preferred otherwise, but since I've been asked, let me say, I think both presentations help in clarifying a number of issues in terms of the relationship that has existed for so many years in different circumstances between China and Africa. And I think both, in particular the first presentation, I think gave us a better characteristic of that approach and the relationships that have existed with China throughout all the years. And of course with the liberation movements and independent states that were also part of the decolonization process and support for liberation movements. Indeed, China has always been there. And I think there's a lot of common experiences and understanding of the dynamics of what happened, again in the context of the Cold War, given what we were being drawn into in terms of geopolitical tensions that are emerging now. And that experience will have to come in very handy because we have traversed that path and we're able to work together to find the best possible ways of surviving under the circumstances. For us, it was even more difficult because we had to try and maneuver through very difficult circumstances during that period in order to survive. So we know what it means. And I think it's important also to have that reflection in terms of how far that relationship has gone, under what circumstances. And from what Ambassador Shu was also present, it becomes important because there is a link in terms of where we are going, where we are now and where we are going. We have to be able to truthfully and accurately make an assessment of the threats and opportunities that will defy our cooperation, because sometimes cooperation between China and Africa is marred in a lot of confusion, not from Africans. Again, from those who don't want that relationship to flourish, and the impact and influence and example of China's development trajectory under very difficult circumstances, and to be able to be where you are today, it's an inspiration. And of course there are some experiences, not all of them pleasant, but and I think these are some of the lessons that we have to learn in terms of how to work together in dealing with these common challenges. It's not going to be easy. The complexities of the conflicts and other developmental challenges that we are going to face would demand that we find the possible opportunities to do this kind of exercise, where we can really be able to think together and identify what is it that we think we can be able to work together on, so that there is a common purpose. And also, as you've indicated, within cooperation with the AU, and particularly within the United Nations, we have to look at a number of other issues in terms of the UN and the challenges that it poses for Africa. And of course, China being part of the group of 77, that is helpful. But we need to again begin to redefine that relationship in terms of the new challenges that we are beginning to face. If you alluded to what is happening in West Africa, and then the relationship between peace, security, and development becomes critical in this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I would like now to open the floor to questions coming from the floor itself, the people in front of me. Would somebody mute? Thank you for getting rid of the echoing. I think we're going to organize the discussion by taking one question at a time, directed towards a particular presenter. I see Professor Antonius van Nieuwkerk's hand. That was the first eager hand raising up. You would be second. And when I point you out, would you kindly also introduce yourself to the audience? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Professor Antonius van Nieuwkerk. I'm based at the Thabo Mbeki School. I work in international relations and diplomacy studies. I want to thank the two speakers this morning who joined us virtually all the way from Beijing. Mr. Li Wentao and Ambassador Xu Zhan. Thank you very much. You've set the tone for a conversation that needs to be taken forward beyond this conference, which is what Ambassador Nhlapho correctly pointed out. How do we understand the relationship between China and Africa? On what foundations or pillars is it built? And where are the strengths, the weaknesses, and the opportunities? So I want to use the opportunity now to ask a question to the panel, and I don't really mind who picks it up. It's a broad question. So in my understanding of the Chinese approach to Africa, it is in support of our developmental goals and the vision of Agenda 2063. And to that extent, the Chinese approach is informed by its role in BRICS, its Indo-Pacific strategy, its Belt and Road Initiative, and this morning I was reminded again of the Global Civilization Initiative, GCI. GCI. I had to confess, I had to Google it quickly, so I need to know more about that. But my question is, if that is so, what is it that we as Africans can encourage the Chinese government and people to do to help us improve, reshape, upgrade, strengthen APSA, the African Peace and Security Architecture? Because Mr. Wen Hao opened by saying that security, peace and security in Africa is not improving, to the contrary. And in my view, if we don't rethink the basis of APSA, what progress will we make? And the biggest example of failure is our inability to silence the guns. If governments and the AU can't do it, what is the role of the people? What is the role of the people, citizens, in this emerging and strengthening relationship between China and Africa? And then finally, to be provocative, what advice would a Chinese scholar give an African scholar when we think about the crisis in West Africa, in the Sahel, and in Niger? What is our advice to ECOWAS after this conference? Thank you.
Thank you kindly. 3 in 1. Who would like to go first? Ambassador, you are smiling very broadly, so for that little sin, you're going to be the first one to respond to Professor Antoni's questions. Could you kindly unmute?
Li Wentao might be good because I don't understand the French, so I really knew very little about West Africa.
Me too. I can only speak English, but I try my best. I just try my best. Thank you, and thank you for the professors and the questions. And you just maybe you reaffirmed and some big questions, and it is just my thoughts, not my advice. I think I'm not African. Only African can have and your decisions. But I think sometimes, and you know that the AU raised the 2063 agenda as far as you just raised, and it is a very strategic and agendas, and also raised the silence, the gun. But I think, and according to the Chinese philosophies, and in general speaking, we often do some things from the small things, easy things, and have some and how to say, and some to divide it to a different phase. And because you know that about the project of the silence, the gun, it reached I think maybe several years ago, 10 years ago, and at that time, and the AU and some African leaders, they wanted to solve the issues maybe just in 5 years. But I think maybe it is it's a very difficult. You know that it is very difficult, even in one country. So I think sometimes from our own and experience, and we should and first get some easy plan, and it is easy for us to achieve. It will give us more and confidence and do that. And you also talk about the Sahel issues and the crisis. I think it is very difficult, but I think for China, and China should be committed to improving African security capabilities. And I think improving African security capacity require capital. We need money and equipment, but I think that cannot adjust the root causes. And if you have the chance and to visit China, and you can find that Chinese citizens and Chinese cities, and maybe other safety and we safe and in the world, where we can maintain vibrant and market economy. I think maybe we can share some experience and with our African and friends. And I think now currently, and China has an academic to strengthen the cooperations and with an African side. But it's not just give money, but I think we should share some experience. But first, I think we should have a strong and responsible government. It is very important. As I mentioned, and the largest group of foreigners in Africa is Chinese, and Chinese safety in Africa is most important issues for Chinese government. Sometimes, and I found that, and the security and the values of philosophies exchanges, it is maybe the first and important. I think it is maybe the most important. I think it is the scholars' obligations to do that, because as far as we know, we can see that the concept of international security or some national security is basically dominated by the Western values. Western values often divided and the world into black or white, or some good or evil. I think such values can easily create conflict. But we can see that I just recently talk about the principle of indivisible security, and I think maybe we have similarities and with the idea of like the Ubuntu of South Africa. I think it is our work, our China and African scholars and think tanks should play a more important role and in regard. And how can we have some shared values and shared experience doing that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response. Are you covered, Prof. Nyakag?
I think in the course of the discussion, we will hear more about how APSA can be strengthened through joint projects and approaches and common understandings, including values and principles, that will take us a little bit away from the dominant narrative from the West so that we can set the agenda ourselves. I foresee a lot of additional cooperation and deepening of cooperation between academics and scholars to do the things that he talks about. What are the root causes? How do we respond? How do we respond as a collective, as humanity? Thank you.
Thank you kindly. You have just introduced and announced the conference. Thank you. I'm going to take our second speaker and our third question on the floor there. Apologies, the roaming mic over there. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Pogas Matita from the Department of History here at UNISA. My question is, I think it's directed to Mr. Lee Wantao. And it's related to what he said about the principle of invisible, the principles that China upholds, and one being the principle of invisible and individual security. I wish he could explain that slightly more, especially in as far as the notion of individual autonomy and citizenship are concerned, those two notions, versus the so-called global democracy, which is oftentimes imposed unto us, and that also imposes certain rules and expectations for states, especially if the state is to be regarded as legitimate. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Any response now at this point? Your mic, you're muted.
It's okay?
Yes, thank you.
It's okay. Okay, thank you. Yes, I just thank you for the ladies and the questions. I think you just talk about. I just talk about the indivisible and security and principle. Yes, I think it is. How to say that? It is just. I think it is a very cool and principle and security principles, and for the global security initiative concept paper and released by China this year. It is very important because, and we from our observations we found that, and currently the world is sometimes is in chaos, and some big powers they presumed the security interests, but they presumed the absolute rights or powers. I think, and some countries maybe built their securities upon the insecurity of other countries. And we can see that, and what happened in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya. Yes, maybe some powers, they can find the security and interests in these countries. Or maybe they can hold the flag and to anti-terrorism. But for these countries, and what left for the people? Just and war, just and terrorism conflict. So I think it is very important and reasons for China to uphold the principle of indivisible securities. That is advocating the in and divisibility and between the the traditional security and not traditional security, and the government relations and the government and the common people's relations. I think it is and for example, we sometimes currently and China and India we have territorial conflict, but we still uphold these principles to deal with our dispute. We think we are not zero-sum game and in this world, and China needs India, and India also needs China. So I think maybe it's the concept and for us. And then we talk about the security rights and the security obligations. And sometimes you cannot just talk about what is my rights, but you also should take responsibility. And we often say R2P, right to and R2P, right to and responsibility protect. And we often the protect and but sometimes we need emphasize and the responsibility obligations. So if you wanted to solve problems, you cannot make big problems like what I see in South Sudan in these countries. So I think maybe it is my explanation and my experience for this idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ventao. The next question would be coming from the gentleman in the room on my right. Thank you.
Thank you. I am Dr. Sokfa John from the Center for Mediation in Africa, University of Pretoria. I would like to hear from the speakers just their thoughts on the connection, if there's any in their view, between China's economic interest in Africa and peace and security. And I'm asking this in the context of the reception of China's growing interest in Africa, which has been mixed, and one of the popular views being that China's presence in Africa is more of a neo-colonial sort of presence. And we know that coloniality or neo-coloniality in any form has never been good for peace and security in Africa. So in that light, I would like to hear their thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think that one is directed towards you in particular, if you care to respond.
Okay, I'll try. And I really do not understand what's the, how do I say, how should we define the colonialism? Because from my understanding, when the Chinese economic how do I say, entities or the those entrepreneurs working in the Africa, their numbers are relatively, maybe half of them. They are saying that before the COVID-19, that is in 2019, there might be less than 1 million Chinese on the African continent. And I think half or more than half of them are the workers and the engineers and so on, doing their jobs with the contracts or Chinese assistance projects in Africa. So they are mainly for the how do I say, implementation or working or construction of the products. They would not stay there forever. And those small traders, but in the recent decade, there are more manufacturers are working or went to Africa in about 5 or 6 years ago. And they mainly already came back. When they were there, they were just produce those things and then try to sell them to the local market or according to the request by some of the African countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda, where I had worked. They insist on or they require that Chinese factories have to export their products to Europe and the United States. So the Ethiopian and Rwandan enjoy the value added at home and increase their employment. So I really do not think there are anything contradictory among these, we call it a common development, not actually a kind of assistance, because there are room for the Chinese or there are need for the Chinese to invest there, to make things there, so we go there. And it is a kind of market orientation. It is not instruction or pushed by any governments, either not or neither by the Ethiopian government or the Chinese government. So I really don't know where does this so-called popular understanding of the neocolonialism coming from. I don't know whether I answered the question or not.
Thank you so much.
Maybe, and Chair, can I and respond to this question?
Apologies, Dr.
Okay.
Wintar, would you like to provide a short input, please?
Okay, and I just talk about colonial issues. I think maybe no Chinese government or Chinese people want to impose our ideas on African side, and also give some of the political conditions, preconditions, or military preconditions. But I am a special advisor to the China-African Chamber of Commerce, as just Ambassador Xu raised. After the last 3 years, there are some Chinese companies and Chinese citizens evacuated from Africa because of the academic issues. And currently, I know that many African countries want to introduce some Chinese investment or capitals to African. But I have a survey within the Chamber of Commerce. We have done a survey of Chinese companies. And what are you most worried about doing business in Africa? And the social security issues, social safety issues, maybe is ranked number 1. And the number 2 is about the political instability and policy changes. And therefore, I think it is really necessary for China and Africa to cooperate in the field and to enhance the security environment. I think it is not relevant to some about mixed or economic and security issues. I think it is not 100 years ago or 50 years ago. And from our cultures and Chinese perpetrators, I don't think, and we will do that. And that's why many African countries, they even welcomed the Chinese and the military to visit Africa, or even in some West Africans, they welcomed some the Chinese and peacekeepings there, or even have some stations or some very deep cooperations in security. It is really sensitive, but as far as we know, many African countries welcome China because they don't think China is a threat, security threat. China will not, and maybe have a regime change or do anything like this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, allow me the opportunity to thank each and every participant for your really thought-provoking and forward-looking questions. But a special thanks to our 2 presenters, Dr. Wen Tao and Ambassador Xu Chan, for guiding us and sharing their expertise and their wisdom and their knowledge, and providing us a historical context, but also outlining, as we've seen, a few key agenda items for future relationships between Africa and China in the interest of sustainable development. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now, ladies and gentlemen, you are invited to have some tea. We are 5 minutes behind schedule, but so may I please ask you to be back at 10 to 11. Thank you very much.
This is part 2 of the symposium and conversations we'll be having with new panelists and guests. I first want to make some apologies on behalf of one delegate who unfortunately is unable to connect or present this morning. I think perhaps because of connection issues, we're not too sure. There's been a breakdown in communication. But that's it, and his name is Professor Emmanuel Kwesi Anning. He is the director within the Faculty of Research and Academic Affairs at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. He would have been our key presenter for the second session, but we have replaced him once again with the esteemed Ambassador Nhlapo, who will provide us with a thorough introduction to this theme. After that, we will then engage in a series of short presentations by Dr. Cecilia Nedziwe, who is a senior lecturer at Rhodes University within the Department of Political and International Studies. And then we'll move on to a presentation by Dr. Pilani Mthembu, who is the Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Unfortunately, Dr. Mthembu is still on his way, but he will be available to make the presentation a little later. Ladies and gentlemen, let's once again give a warm welcome to Ambassador Nhlapo, who will provide us with an introduction to this second session. Many thanks. Apologies, I forgot to introduce the main man in the building regarding this session, Professor Anthony van Niekerk, who is part of the Thabo Mbeki School and Professor in Peace and Security Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, he's our moderator and he will be providing us with direction regarding this conversation. Thank you very much. To all panelists, welcome and thank you. Let's give them a warm applause. Thank you. Now we'll hand over the mic to Prof. Van, who will then moderate the discussions. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Take a breather, my brother. Have your coffee. And thanks for holding the conference together so well. Much appreciated. And then also, before Ambassador Welile starts to talk, welcome again. You're a friend of UNISA. Our building belongs to you and you belong to us. I'm stealing you away from a cord. They've overused you, and you now have time to engage on more academic stuff with the professors and the academics at this institution. In fact, I was saying to my colleagues who organized the event, beyond the debates that you hear and the YouTube video that will be available, we're going to capture the key messages and make sure that our students get this when we teach and lecture, when we research and publish. The things that we've generated here must become available. There's a session on that after this. And why is this important to hear an experienced ambassador and panelists talk about these topics? It is because we're at a crossroads as a country and as a continent. In fact, you must agree with me that in next week in Sandton, well, Sandton will close because the BRICS summit will descend upon Johannesburg. And it's not only the 4 or the 5 BRICS alliance partners, it's invitations to all of African leaders and beyond. So this is a big event, and there's a reason why the BRICS summit has become so important. It is going to demand from us as Africans to answer these questions. Who are we? Who are we? Why do we receive these visitors? What do we want from BRICS? More provocatively, what do we want from a BRICS plus, an enlarged alliance? How does this play out against the very dominant narrative from the West, from America, from Europe? Do we abandon them? Or do we accommodate all players on the continent? And on whose terms do we do this? part of these questions and answers are coming out in this conference. It's beginning to emerge. And for me, this is the beginning of a much longer and a deeper conversation that we must have. You might even ask provocatively, I did ask the ambassador, what is the South African government's position on this and on that? They are difficult answers. And South Africa will be tested at the BRICS summit. Not only do we host, but intellectually we have to engage the current and the incoming partners. These are tough tasks in difficult times. So that is the perspective and the background against which we are gathering here, listening to each other, and also be guided by experts in the field. For example, our Chinese colleagues who spoke just a few minutes earlier gave important messages in that very enigmatic Chinese style of theirs. You have to listen carefully and decode the messages. We also gave them messages, didn't we? We surfaced some issues. If you ask me, this is the beginning of a conversation that needs to continue. It's really important. I don't have to overemphasize why China plays such an important role in Africa and in BRICS going forward. Our position must be clear, and my last sentence on this is, just maybe tongue-in-cheek. Often at a conference like this, people would say, China has an Africa policy. It's in Mandarin, but it's also translated, it's on Google. Does Africa have a China policy? In whatever language? What is our strategic approach to this very important player? We need to understand that better. And part of my expectation is that we hear more in this session about the African approach to peace diplomacy. I don't know, Ambassador, if you can explain that part when you start. Peace diplomacy. What is the African or the Pan-African approach, and who do we partner with as we forge ahead in trying to recover lost ground, not only in the Sahel but elsewhere on the continent? So with this sort of brief introduction, I'm going to ask Ambassador Nhlapo to open the floor for us, to give us some perspective, and then we're going to go to the panelists. We might have to start with you because Pilani is still on his way. And as you know, the Institute for Global Dialogue, IGD, is also deeply involved in setting agendas around these issues that we're discussing today. Ambassador, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anthony. It's unfortunate that we've not been able to have a question from Accra joining us, because I think we would have, from the discussions that we've had yesterday, they've had a different perspective or additional, given where he operates from the Kofi Annan Center on peacekeeping, because it's indeed its purpose was really to begin to interrogate and to develop on these issues in terms of how, as Africans, do we respond or conceptualize or develop solutions that are appropriate, which we can own in terms of dealing with the challenges that are facing us. We used to joke, I was seconded to the United Nations at some stage after Burundi. There was a time when we had a very difficult moment at the UN. Started by one gentleman who's a friend of Trump, John Bolton. I don't know what kind of friendship exists between them, but they're both at a different wavelengths. John Bolton had started at the time of the end of Kofi Annan's term of office in January, because he doesn't believe in the United Nations, basically. And that's why you could not even get the nod of Congress as the ambassador to the UN, because of his ideas about the UN. In the end, he went because George Bush wanted him there. And it became a problem. And some of us had to deal with him. And one of the things that he had started at the beginning of that year is that as long as the UN continues to procure or have self-sustained capacity to do things in-house, there is a problem because they are based in the United States, they are based in New York, and there are service providers in the United States who can provide those services. So to cut costs, the UN does not need the huge stuff that they have, which is then whose task is to deal with the in-house issues, whatever production from documents to anything. Whatever was there in the UN as a self-contained organization that you can outsource to American entrepreneurs and private sector. And if that is not done within a particular period, the budget is not going to be released. Now, if you don't release the budget, it means the United Nations is not going to function. And indeed, there was a hold on the budget. Budget is not going to be released until the following conditions have been met. There were extra others. Of course, the G77, a group of G77 plus China, but of course G77, particularly Ambassador Tumsan Kumalo was leading, was the chair of the G77, and was asked also from the senior African staff within the UN that this is one thing that cannot be allowed. Apparently it happened before. And they do it even with Congress in the US. They shut down Congress. The same approach. You don't want to conform, we'll shut you down until you do what we say you must do. If not, then go. Don't have to wait until the end of your term. You can leave. Now that's Kofi Annan in that situation. So we used to joke that they are dealing with somebody that they might not be able to manage because Kofi Annan started with the UN at the nursery, went to primary school and then ended up being Secretary General. So anything UN was about his upbringing. He grew up with that institution. So you touch him, he's got an answer because it's from experience, he knows. And you can't deal with those issues in the manner in which it has happened. Having got him as a compromise candidate after kicking out Brutus Ghali, as I said, they thought that he will then be somebody that they will be able to control. And of course, that did not happen. I don't want to go deep in this issue. I am saying, based on all those experiences and others, and of course, as somebody who worked and who was responsible for the Department of Peacekeeping Operations under Boutros Ghali, and knowing the relationship between peace politics of the UN and then peacekeeping, this whole diplomacy, peace diplomacy, the value chain, if one can put it in the story, and that understanding, you thought that this kind of institute was necessary to be able to continue this debate of looking at how you can make the UN more responsive to the challenges that it was set up to deal with. That's why I'm saying that it would have been very good if we could have had a Kwesi, because it would then give us also the other perspectives in terms of what that institution represents and the thinking that it has generated and in terms of the programs that they've been running and what is happening in improving APSA, as you were saying, the African Peace and Security architecture. How do we begin to deal with those challenges? As we were saying yesterday, this thing of African solutions to African problems, we need to unpack it very carefully. It should not just be as stated. Sometimes we talk of African solutions to African challenges, to move away from this one. But what is it that we are trying to do in the course of those debates is precisely to shape the perspectives, African perspectives on peace diplomacy, because we have been there. If you look at where it started, in terms of the structures of the AU, for instance, the Committee on Conciliation and Mitigation, which were dealing with intrastate conflicts because of border disputes. That's where it all started. On a practical basis, because we're taking a decision which we need to examine, by the way, re-examine in the light of the current tensions and challenges that we're faced with. This whole issue, which was correct at the time of the invaluability of borders that we inherited from colonialism, is it sustainable? Is it something that we can be able to look at and see how we can be able to handle? At some point there was a thinking that the African integration process will help us resolve those challenges, because then we will be acting in unison to deal together with these kinds of challenges. But we're not yet there, we're not getting there. How do we then begin to think about these issues? I mean, you've got a lot of areas of tensions. If people in Lesotho are beginning to raise the issue of Bloemfontein, just immediately after the last election, a debate that we all thought was tired and dead. A party, one man, shook the whole of Lesotho because he started this debate when they did not expect it. Want our land back. Up again. Swaziland is claiming right up to Springs. And from time to time, if there's a challenge with them, they bring about this thing. There's a standing committee that they have to deal with these land claims. They actually claim even up to Maputo. And these are issues that come up from time to time. With the problem with Namibia on the Orange River border, shifting it one way or another because somebody had said that there's some resources there, oil and diamonds and other things. Malawi and Tanzania recently had a challenge which was put on hold because this committee of former heads of state had to deploy President Chisano, assisted by Mukhai and Thabo Mbeki, to put a hold on this thing, because Tanzania, in parliament, people already were saying deploy troops. And there was a debate about the lake. Is it Lake Malawi or Lake Nyasa or Lake Tanganyika, extension of that? Very hotly. So I'm saying that these are all the challenges which we thought that we could be able to handle through these regional economic communities and cooperation, which will then feed into the broader integration. So it means that we need to really think about these issues, because where are the roots of these things? If there's going to be dispute on border issues like those ones, like what Namibia and Botswana once had, on the Karakhari pens. You remember the thing that even diplomacy, it had to be solved by the International Court of Justice as to where does that strip belong to, who does it belong to. So you've got pockets of that almost everywhere. What you can call unfinished business. So what our perspectives in terms of peace diplomacy? How do we then identify those threats that will create problems that will need us to begin to deal with those issues, including treaties that were signed during colonial times? The issue around the DERC, for instance, the dam in Ethiopia, between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. It's about an agreement that was signed between the BRICS and Egypt on the issue of the Nile. And this was supposed to be what will govern, because for Egypt to survive, for Egypt to be to where what it is, the Nile is critical. Since that time, so it's all about unraveling this agreement, which is extended to other countries, what is called the Great Lakes region proper, because of the source of the Nile and those lakes whose waters flow into the Nile. It's a complex problem, watershed causes. So there are a number of issues because of climate change also now is getting worse, that we should begin to think around and say what kind of solutions do we have. But to be able to talk about peace diplomacy, you should be able to identify the challenges that will need solutions that will begin to get countries and the continent into processes of dialogue, where you can identify the problems, the challenges, and try as best as possible to find solutions which would be consistent with our Pan-African perspectives and common prosperity. Otherwise, if that is not the basis on which we have to deal with these things, we're in big trouble. If every country in Africa is going to end up having oil, you can imagine, and many of them are discovering oil, and it's becoming a headache and a problem. How do you manage this thing? Where does it end up? We have to start thinking, and that's why yesterday I was raising the issue that if our institutions of higher learning and our students are doing PhD and the research that is being done is not related to these issues, and you leave it to politicians, I don't think we're going to be able to take this country forward, because we need that brain power that will be driven by one desire alone, to save this continent and bringing together everybody and all the resources that we have to come up with policies that will assist us to manage our own affairs, and then our independence will have full meaning. So there are no areas that we cannot be able to touch. So I'm saying in the introduction that I was hoping that, and I hope I am not misrepresenting what you would have presented, but I was just trying to approach the subject in terms of peace diplomacy, having been involved in some of these things and some of the intricacies, that if we don't make a proper identification of the challenge, understand its context, its history, we are bound to make mistakes, because in some cases you'll have to go to the, that's why yesterday I was talking about African problems. Right now, if you have to solve the problem of the Sudan, the maps that will tell you what the Sudan looked like before all of these agreements that we entered into are with the Brits. The British have them. Right now, Sudan, you can't have the borders, even between north and south and within the Sudan. in all the regions. They have the maps. Darfur was, they defined what Darfur is, because for Darfur to exist, it was necessary, otherwise the cotton mills in Manchester would not be running. So it was a labor-intensive cotton production area that you needed, a place like Darfur, what is now Darfur as an independent problem within Sudan. But only the British can be able, honestly, to define some of those things and how Darfur relates to the rest of the other regions of the Sudan. And if you talk about the Sudan, what is it that you are talking about? I'm just saying that perhaps these are some of the issues that might want to get into. I know that sometimes these are issues that people don't want to touch, but they are with us now. And it's for us to be able to say, what do we do about them? And how do we use the institutions that we have and our independence and sovereignty collectively and individually as countries to be able to make sure that this Africa that we want actually becomes a reality. Thank you very much. I will throw it back to the white man to control us.
Pilani, welcome. See what you've walked into.
That is my brother, this one, don't worry.
I'm rethinking your position here at UNISA. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for setting the scene. I agree, you give us the key framing questions. We've been discussing many of them, and it's a struggle. For example, yesterday, he ended on an emotional note by saying, we must respect the institutions that we have created as Africans. Allow them to do their work. But when you go to Midrand, there's a parliament there. It's the Pan-African Parliament. Who of you have been there? In fact, why should you go there? What would attract you to go there? Is it that mood of intellectualism, that drive to solve our problems, the respect that parliamentarians have for politicians and citizens, and a proud institution, well managed, accountable for the budget we give them? Thank you, David. Thank you. You don't go there for those things. You don't seek enlightenment from the PAP. It is failing us. Okay, so this is a difficult conversation that we're having. But now, thanks for the opening session. Kofi Annan can't be with us this morning, unfortunately, Pilani, but it doesn't matter because we've got you and Cecilia all the way from Rhodes University, Eastern Cape. She says that they are standing strong. And in fact, they're putting up symbols of resistance and conquering and conquest. It's a wonderful university. It's a fantastic department. We are delighted to have you with us. I'm always of the view that political scientists and IR scholars in the African setting need to work more closely together. Once upon a time, we wrote a textbook for IR students, sponsored by the Institute for Global Dialogue. That was many years ago, and it's time to do that again. I was begging the HSRC to sponsor this, but they didn't come to the party. Perhaps Accord might want to think of sponsoring us, writing an IR textbook for African students. And why is this important? The world is changing in front of our eyes. The ambassador is explaining the potential impact of that on us. And so if we leave all of this to the politicians, what kind of solutions will we get? To further embroider and dig a little bit deeper into these key themes, we've got two speakers now, or panelists, Cecilia Nedziwe and Pilani Ntembo, Rhodes, Institute for Global Dialogue. Are we ready for BRICS? Pilani. Is Santon ready for BRICS? Oh, I worry about that. In your response, touch a little bit on BRICS. Because one of the questions when you were on your way here, we had 2 Chinese scholars to talk to us about their understanding of us. It's fantastic. You know, we need to develop our understanding of them. And we did tease them, you know, how do you understand BRICS and BRICS Plus? But the Chinese are enigmatic in the way that they respond. So IGD will take us to a study tour to Beijing next year to further deepen our understanding. So how much time, Cecilia, do you want to talk to us about these burning issues? Oh, perfect. 7 to 10. Yeah, you're most welcome. You bring a bit of gender balance here to these panels, you know. It's important. You've got the floor. Can you speak into this microphone?
So before I get into the presentation, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to what is a very important conversation. And I say so because I see the need for the broadening and deepening of the conversation of Africa's place in international relations, as well as our voice in these global spaces, and the need for us to push this conversation in the classroom space. Because from my experience and what I'm seeing in the classroom space is that our students don't know more about the continent. Sometimes it's very sad that the people from outside actually understand us more than we understand ourselves, or they know about the processes that are happening on the continent than we ourselves know and able to articulate them. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So I want to share my thoughts on the idea of peace diplomacy by focusing on the idea of Pan-African diplomacy and what it means in the African context by way of defining what peace by Africans and for Africans means practically, by drawing on some of the illustrations of this peace diplomacy, as well as its limits. I do not intend to romanticize Pan-African diplomacy or Africa's peace diplomacy, but the idea here is to draw on the actual idea of Pan-African diplomacy and some of its illustrations, and how this signifies agency that can build in the new agenda for peace. So my presentation will draw on the conversation, the theoretical conversation that is happening in the actual discourse in international relations, as well as draw on the actual practicalities, you know, these illustrations of Africa's Pan-African diplomacy. So in terms of the idea of Pan-African diplomacy, scholars such as Ali Mazrui have done quite a lot of work in helping us understand, for example, his seminal work of 1967, where he provides analysis of Africa's peace initiatives through the concept of Pax Africana. So it does provide us with the basis of understanding the concept of Pan-African diplomacy or collective diplomacy, of the need for African states to assume agency, and agency in terms of setting up its own agenda for peace, as well as taking on, for example, what the ambassador has been talking about, of this idea of the African solution to the African problem, but again going by the conversation that we had yesterday and the presentation, the sort of theater, the conflict theater is quite complex. The continent is not only dealing with those conflicts that are emerging from within the continent, but those that are fueled by the external actors. So in terms of conceptualizing the idea of Pan-African diplomacy, I do draw on the work of scholars such as Ali Mazrui, as well as those by African scholars who are defining African agency here to speak to those intentional, meaningful actions by Africans to address their own problems, here to avert conflicts or to halt violence. So when we talk about Pan-African diplomacy, this conversation has been framed in terms of common positions, promoting solidarity, and this has been framed at various levels. So when we talk about the process of decolonization, we see that the idea of common positions both within the Organization of African Unity as well as the frontline states in order to end colonialism was at the center of these different states organizing for liberation. But when we talk about the idea of common positions, these did not only emerge with the process of decolonization or the post-independence struggles or framing of common positions within the African peace and security architecture. So when we talk about common positions when we talk about common positions, we also want to look back that this did not only come with the process of decolonization. So when we look at, for example, the pre-colonial societies in the African context in West Africa, where women leaders and role players identified common insecurities within societies, as well as strategies of addressing these different insecurities. For example, the Ife Amadume talks to the secret societies of women that would bring men to account for the social ills within the societies as a way of dialoguing with the men to address those insecurities within the societies. So just to point out that the issue of common positions did not emerge with the process of decolonizations. Our societies have been identifying these problems and finding ways of dialoguing to resolve these conflicts, and women have actually played a key role, so not only in West Africa, but also in the post-independence period. We see women coming in the different spaces in order to identify the non-traditional insecurities as well as strategies of addressing these different insecurities. So again, when we talk about the responsibility to protect societies, this is not a new phenomenon that emerged with, for example, Francis Deng, who introduced the concept of responsibility to protect within the African context. Of course, this concept has been used or it has been applied at a global level. So in terms of the illustrations of Pan-African diplomacy or collective diplomacy around peace, there are some examples that we can point to. For example, the power-sharing agreements that we've seen across the continent in the case of Kenya, Zimbabwe, and South Sudan. But these power-sharing agreements have been largely viewed as big men's pacts, in that they've been seen as maintaining particular political elites in power, as opposed to agency that addresses the aspirations of the peoples in those particular territories. Another example that can point to Pan-African, a Pan-African approach to addressing peace is some of the examples that are emerging from West Africa. For example, when you look at Nigeria's role in stabilizing the West African region, here, particularly Liberia and Sierra Leone in the 1990s, which was illustrative of Africa's capacity to solve its own problems. And we also have different norms within the African peace and security architecture. So when you look at the Solemn Declaration on Common African Defense and Security Policy, as well as the African Union Non-Aggression Common Policy. So all those do speak to Africa's common position on issues of security and peace. But however, challenges remain, and the context within which peace is being sought within the African context is very, very complex. First, we've seen that while we have these common positions within the AU context, the implementation has been very questionable. There are issues of political will to implement these common positions. For example, while the African Union has a common position not to host foreign military bases on the continent, we've seen that the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, has had increasing agreements since September 11 with many of our African countries such as Niger, Ghana, Mali, Nigeria, Kenya, just to mention a few. And also within the Southern African development context, we've seen that while there is an agreement within the SADC framework not to host AFRICOM on the continent, we've seen that Botswana has signed an agreement. There is a military base in Botswana. And also most recently, Zambia signed an agreement with the US Africa Command to host an office on security cooperation. And there's been a debate in terms of the difference between a military base and an office on security cooperation. When you actually go into the case of Ghana, you see that there's actually no difference. It's just a change of name. So it then complicates, this idea of Pan-African diplomacy, of peace diplomacy on the continent, that while we have these common positions, for example, the Africa Peace Council is not able to hold the member states to account, to bring them to account in terms of going against these common positions, for example, to set up these military bases on the continent. But there's also the issue of countries taking positions based on their national interest. So the challenge with these common positions is that there are also these bilateral agreements that countries are engaging in that do challenge the actual idea and practice of having a collective policy to deal with the issues of peace and security on the continent, as well as to deal with the issue of Africa's sovereignty to protect its territorial and juridical integrity.
So again, just to, I think as a way of concluding, but I think before I get to this point, I think it's also important to highlight that there are countries that have, that are seemingly taking the positions, the common positions seriously. For example, when you look at the case of South Africa, South Africa has stuck to the agreement of SADC not to host, at least for now, they've stuck to the common position not to host a military base on the African military base on the South African soil, but we'll see whether with time South Africa will still continue or will still abide by its commitment not to host the military base on the soil of South Africa. So lastly, I wanted to touch on the case of Niger, which casts light on Africa's weaknesses to galvanize around a Pan-African agenda, what is happening in the region, the role of Nigeria and ECOWAS in the region to side with the West, does challenge the idea of collective diplomacy, of a Pan-African approach to resolving the conflict. But what also complicates the Nigeria case is that while under the current president, Tinubu, the supposed icon of democracy, Nigeria is essentially siding with the West. And this is despite that France for years has sabotaged Nigeria's leadership role in ECOWAS. So I think just as a way of concluding, so there is a dominant narrative in the discourse that that categorize African states as quasi-states, as having negative sovereignty, so categorizing African states as weak in that we are still not developed, we are still not at the same level with other countries in the West. So that is then used as an excuse to intervene in Africa's processes. And that is also used to categorize Africa as a weak state. So I do argue that Africa's weaknesses, or Africa's weakness, is not located in this dominant narrative. Africa has its weaknesses, but these weaknesses can be found in Africa's inability to self-critique, Africa's inability to set its own agenda, as well as to comply with the common positions that they agree to. So I'd want to end on that note. Yeah.
You will agree with me that was a powerful end note. And what she's done so well is to explain to us those dilemmas we face in reconciling common positions with national interests. They tear us apart. We want to go one way, but you get a delegation or a visit from a foreign power, and the next thing is you move your foreign policy towards another position. Overnight. There are many examples. Libya is one of the case studies of how we were taken apart by foreigners. So thanks for a very eloquent essay that you presented to us. It'll go into the collection. Very valuable. Thank you so much. You've raised interesting questions. There will be time for you to ask and to share your own view as the audience. But for now, we're going to turn our attention to the IGD. Pilani, allow me to say that when Cecilia said one of the writers who inspired her, an African scholar, is the late and great Ali Mazrui. We invited him to open the Institute for Global Dialogue. It was called the Foundation for Global Dialogue. in the late 1990s. He gave a brilliant presentation, like an inaugural address almost, but also very controversial. He said we must rethink this trusteeship system of the UN. This was pre-R2P, which, by the way, is a doctrine that has died, Cecilia. And he said, if states who can't or won't, who are taken apart, don't we have a collective responsibility? And he called it something else. It's worth reading or rereading. You must put his speech on your website. It's worth rereading again. Really great and late icon, I think, of intellectualism in Africa. Let me hand over to you, and let's hear from you what your perspectives are on our ability to forge a Pan-African or Pan-Africanist, perhaps, approach to peace and security, and what is preventing us from getting there. Or maybe there are avenues that we haven't spotted yet. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you, colleagues. You know, I think the closing remarks from Cecilia sort of, you know, it's an excellent bridgeway towards the paper that I'm developing. Because the sort of working, you know, title is around African peace diplomacy and the search for strategic autonomy towards a holistic approach. Now, why that? It's because I think many of the challenges that we are facing, the examples you mentioned, whether it's Libya and a couple of other, you know, case studies, many of the problems we encounter is that we have not been consistently addressing the root causes of conflict. And so we put, you know, a plaster on a number of issues, and it seems as though it's fine for now. But then, you know, over time, these wounds continue to reopen themselves. So I think when we're moving towards an African approach, it's an approach that has to be rooted in some of the things that Cecilia, you're mentioning. You know, we have to draw on indigenous knowledge systems, but we also have to understand to what extent are those knowledge systems actually catered for in our mainstream approaches, or we prioritize mainstream approaches and our political institutions actually do not have space, you know, to actually bring some of these approaches that you're mentioning, you know. So it has to be about addressing the root causes of those conflicts. It's going to take a longer period of time to, you know, let's say build sustainable solutions to some of the conflicts that we encounter. But at its core, an African approach towards peace diplomacy has the issue of addressing the root causes. Now, I'm not defining what those root causes are, because it means that when we encounter challenges, we need to discuss, and we need to research, and we need to consult widely, not only state actors, so it can't be just a top-down approach. We have to also be widely engaging, you know, the people and the communities that are involved at times in those conflicts, broaden the stakeholders. And that's about addressing what the root causes, about understanding firstly what are those root causes. The problem we have, like you mentioned in Niger, is that, you know, before even dialogue, you know, took place, we already had the threat of military intervention. You know, so before even actually any form of engagement could even, you know, really take place, we've already had, you know, the threat of an intervention here. Now, you know, it's not necessarily speaking to the merits or the demerits of a military type intervention to restore constitutional order. But it does sort of say that unless you're engaging in a proper dialogue, it becomes quite difficult to address the root causes of conflicts. What happens is that different sides simply harden their positions. And you basically put them in a corner where they may have been open to engage, where they actually tend to then harden, you know, their positions. And that just leads to further escalation. The other point is that development remains an imperative. So when we are addressing the root causes of conflict, we know that on our continent, development remains an imperative. But we also know that in addressing issues of development, these are not just local issues. You know, these are, we are part of a broader international system. And some of those root causes don't necessarily lie here. And this is the challenge. You know, at times it's quite simplistic to say, you know, oh, Africa is poorly governed, or, you know, weak states and all of these types of things. But then what? You know, are we trying to understand, you know, what are some of the systemic causes of that? Who benefits from some of those conditions we outline? Who are the winners, who are the losers? You know, and that goes again to that point about understanding those root causes. So development remains an imperative. So when we're talking about peace, you know, and security in Africa, we're not only talking about the role of the military or the role of the police in establishing, you know, peace and order. You know, we're talking about our economic structures, we're talking about social cohesion, we're talking about, you know, whether the resources that we have, you know, are benefiting, you know, the communities where they are being extracted, you know, from. We are trying to understand the global value chains and where we fit in those global value chains. You know, when we talk about issues of industrialization, you know, people might sort of instinctively say, yes, of course, Africa must industrialize. This is important. But we must also be realistic and factor in that for certain regions of the continent to industrialize has a negative impact on other parts of the world, which rely on access to very cheap, you know, minerals in areas where they are being extracted. So when we put Africa's development at the forefront, we must not be, you know, sort of naive to think that prioritizing industrialization will not face a backlash. And that means that in prioritizing development, we must think about how do we safeguard the positions that we take towards issues like industrialization, towards issues like developing regional value chains, so that we can employ more of our people, so that we can move higher up the value chain, you know, so that we're not buying, you know, we speak, you know, sort of randomly about, you know, buying the best Belgian chocolate or buying the best, you know, sort of coffee, coffee from Germany, and things like that. Whereas all these things are actually being made, here. So how do we move up the value chain? That's part of addressing the root causes of conflict, because it's addressing where the continent is positioned structurally at a global level. Now, also what it becomes important is tackling then the challenges of state building and social cohesion. The challenge is that we are still largely dealing with, let's take an example like South Africa, all right? An example like South Africa, yes, it has all the, sort of characteristics of, what we may call a nation state, right? So, not a nation, it's a nation state. Many nations within this particular state. But is South Africa a traditional sort of nation state? I mean, if you just think about the economy in our country, it's always been largely a regional, it's more of a regional state, than a sort of a narrow nation state, and at times I think we find ourselves trying to fit into criteria that were not really defined here. So we know, for instance, why it was important for Europe to adopt what became known as, the modern nation state. Right? We know about the Treaty of Westphalia. We know about the wars that afflicted Europe for many, many years, it's only really after World War II where in Europe there was some sort of peace, and peace dividend. But really for much of its history, this is a continent that was in conflict. So we know anyway why it made sense, in Europe to adopt what we call the modern nation state. And we are still, I think if we're talking about sort of African approaches to peace and security, if we're talking about peace diplomacy, if we're talking about the importance of strategic autonomy, we're not going to achieve strategic autonomy if we are purely looking at traditional ideas of nation states in Africa. Because it means somewhere, somehow, we're going to have to make, 55, territories somehow work, yes, together, but somehow also fit into a broader international landscape. And does that not play into our existing problems? Does that not make it easier to interfere, in the affairs of the continent? So the reason I think I look at issues like strategic autonomy as important is because I think we can only achieve a higher degree of strategic autonomy, not through the sort of notion of a modern nation state, but through a proper embrace of ideas, of Pan-Africanism. So, and this doesn't completely discard, the state and the state apparatus and so forth, but it certainly does require a rethinking of it. You think about some of the debates in South Africa, right, about which have, and now we've got even political parties that have really formed purely on the basis of almost single issues, deal with migration, deal with illegal migration and all of those things, right? But not necessarily factoring in the complexities of our region, and that's why I sort of think we are more of a regional state than we are, let's say, a traditional nation state. I mean, if you just think about even just historically and even where we find ourselves today. But how do those ideas find their way into our formal systems of governance, into our agreements at a regional level, and also in the allocation, of resources towards those ideas? So, I'm just putting that out there, that we have to think about what does state building mean in our context. Do we need more mini states, on the continent? Or do we need to actually tie some of these states together, through various agreements, practices, allocation of resources, and so forth? The last 2 points is that if we tackle some of these, challenges, then what we are likely to have is more agency, more African agency, but we're also more likely to achieve a higher degree of strategic autonomy. But strategic autonomy, we're not going to achieve it as singular nation states. We're going to achieve it as a continent, which then protects some of our weaker states to be able to tackle some of the root causes, of the conflicts that afflict them. But we do need to achieve a higher degree of strategic autonomy. And of course, there's various things that will aid us in doing that, trading more with one another, facilitating the movement of people. Yes, we can deal with, we can have documented movement of people, but that can be done. There's systems in place that can be done, there's technology that can be done, but we shouldn't be looking to restrict, movement of people. Yes, manage it, that's fine, but we shouldn't be looking to sort of put up more barriers, to the movement of people. And that will help us to attain a higher degree of agency and a higher degree of strategic autonomy. It allows us to also defend some of the policy positions that we take in international relations. But as single states, some very mini states, it becomes too easy to simply take an agreement at the African Union level and then just approach single states as an external power and strike agreements that may even contradict the agreements that you've just made at a continental body. And then the last point, I think, is that we have a role to play in terms of peace diplomacy as a continent. You look at some of the reactions that were there when we had the African Peace Initiative going to speak to President Zelensky and going to speak to President Putin, and some were rather dismissive, like, wow, what are these Africans doing trying to solve a European, conflict? Should we even take them seriously? Should we even entertain them? But the reality is that we have a role to play in terms of peace diplomacy, in terms of sharing the experience that has been accumulated, on this continent in dealing with issues of conflict, in dealing with both local conflicts, but also conflicts that have been clearly stoked by external powers. And we sit in a position where we can clearly see that the Europeans, the Russians, the Americans, all the actors that are involved in the conflict in Ukraine, from our vantage point, we're just seeing further escalation, right? And we can see what escalation will lead to. But we can also see that there is a need to address the European security architecture in a way that deals with the root causes of that conflict that is happening in Europe. And we are watching that all the actions being taken are not dealing with the root causes of that conflict. And we know that it's, of course, besides the fact that we know it's affecting us, but we also know that it's negatively affecting Europe. We know that it's negatively affecting Ukraine. We also know that it's negatively affecting Russia, and it's negatively affecting the United States. And that will have an impact also on the politics, in those particular places. So we are well placed to make a contribution towards finding a peaceful resolution, to this particular conflict that is happening in Ukraine. And that draws from the wealth of practitioners and, thinkers on the African continent who have been dealing with conflicts both during the colonial period but also post the colonial period. And there's a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of experience that can actually be applied not only within Africa but also in other parts of the world. So let me end there.
Thank you. Thank you, Pilani. Strategic autonomy. It's a powerful proposition. So good luck with your paper. I hope it goes. Yeah. Also bring it here to our own conference publication. Okay, you've raised additional issues that I find very challenging and interesting. I must say, on your last point of Ukraine, surely the time has arrived now for us not to eat up without even asking this European example of integration and common foreign and security policy. The way that they helped or co-determined or shaped the African peace and security architecture. When you go to Addis and you look at the AU headquarters, you know what you see there, symbolically. There's a big building donated by one country, and then another building donated by another country. And they use it to listen to us when we talk about them. Yeah. Okay, so I think the agenda is set for you to give us a bit of feedback and input. You might have a question to the panel. The panelists themselves might want to respond as well. I saw the ambassador taking some notes. But the floor is yours now, really, in the first instance. Kwesi, I don't know, how do we engage the online audience? If there's somebody with a burning question, how do we deal with that person? And secondly, how much time do we have?
Greetings, thanks for the question. On the screen, the computer screen that I have, the laptop screen that I have sitting there, it should indicate hands up. Dr. Nedziwe is in the perfect position to see whether...
You can manage that for us.
It's Ambassador, it should be Ambassador Shu online, if I'm correct, but he might not be, but he's probably the only one there online. So he's the online participant who would probably want to ask a question or two. So just pay attention to that if necessary. We are running out of time, so I think we only have about half an hour, 2 rounds possibly, if there are enough questions, but 1 round is good. 1 question per round.
Okay, one question per participant. So no speeches. Morning. Yeah, you're a latecomer, but I see you've got burning questions.
Let me just say this. When I just entered the room, right, I thought you were Bill Clinton, and like literally, wow.
That's another white man.
Wow, right. First and foremost, let me just say this. It's an honor and privilege to be here, very much. I think not only that, your insights, from yourself and the other panelists are very empowering, right? I just want to be short, sweet, and professional, right? First and foremost, I'm Gatlejo. I'm a law student, and besides that, I think that in this day in society, it's very much pivotal that we have such discussions, right? Which is very significant for myself as well as a young person. More especially being a young person, I think we are the future of this society. Differing from Kwame Nkrumah when he said this, right? It's by all means necessary, all right, we spare the future for our nation, and the future is the young people as well. And ma'am, when you spoke about women played a very pivotal force in our society, more especially since the World War, First World War and Second World War. So I just want to know this in this instance, do you still have those particular women that can carry on the baton? Because women were very much decisive in that particular term. Women are able to take care. I remember that in the Great Depression in Germany, as you speak very much largely, when the economy was just going down the drain, right? Women were able to revitalize that and giving men hope, because when men came back from the war, men were very much disgruntled and they were torn apart, right? So do we still have those particular women who can embody those values as well? Like what we've seen in 1956, right? 1956 when women marched right here in Pretoria. So do you still have that particular woman who can ingenuize that passion? Another thing, Mr. Pilar, right? I just want to know this. How do we... I know that Russia played a very pivotal role, most especially in South Africa, in subsidizing some of our struggles towards to be in those particular countries and giving them the right necessities, right? But in this instance, don't you think that it's very much vital that Africa needs to unite and play a part in uniting our own resources, because Africa is so much rich in resources. Yes, we are very much affected by particular things that are happening in Ukraine and Russia right now. But we've got Nigeria. Nigeria's got oil, right? Not Nigeria's got oil. We've got certain other countries as well that have got coal. We've got Ghana as well that has cocoa as well. So don't you think that it's very vital that as African countries that we unite and spare those resources, revitalizing ourselves? Because I just want to quote from Thomas Sankara and say this: who feeds you must take care of you. I think it's about very much time that we unite and just deter from other parts of other Western countries so that you're able to revitalize the economy of this country. That's my question. Thank you very much for the platform.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So that's a Women, Peace and Security agenda item there for you. And then the African Free Trade Agreement and all of the complications around that for you. Yes, sir?
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is to the Ambassador. In instances where you
Just reintroduce yourself.
My name is McDonald Ramala. I'm from the UNISA College of Law. And my question is to the Ambassador. Sorry about that. In instances where you have a foreign country like China owning key infrastructural, key developmental or infrastructural symbols, almost half of them, because these poor countries are in debt to China. Isn't that a ground for future conflict?
Thank you. Okay, sure. The so-called debt trap. Ne? That's very controversial. Madam, you... okay. Yes, then we move on.
Thank you. I wanted to phrase a longish question.
Just tell us again.
Sipogazi from the Department of History here at UNISA.
Yes.
But the interest of time, I'll try and be very brief. To Dr. Cecilia, I wanted to ask whether quiet diplomacy could be one of those that we could leverage on the indigenous African. You didn't mention anything about that. And then to anyone who can answer this, this is what I'm battling with, but to be brief, I will say the masses on the other side, this is what they see: corruption and greed. And none of you is saying anything about that. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's close the questions. Ma'am, it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Chair. My name is Posihle Kumete from the Department of History. I think my question was partly answered, but I'll ask it anyway in case the panelist wants to redress it. My question is on the aspect of justice, especially when we look at the aspect of peace and security. How do we redress or redefine what justice means, or how do we reframe it within the rhetoric of peace and diplomacy? Because I think I came to this question when looking at what Pan-Africanism says about land and what Congress says about land. There's a huge discrepancy there. And a lot of people find it problematic that we don't address that discrepancy, but we rather want to put a Band-Aid, right, and say let's have peace and diplomacy, but we don't solve what the issue is. So how do we then get to the aspect of justice, and what does justice mean in this context?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think maybe a last hand towards the right from our neighbor at Turkies.
Thank you. I'm Sokfa John from UP. My question is, how do we balance or find a balance from a Pan-African perspective, or the perspective that Cecilia talked about? How do we find a balance between self-criticism that Cecilia mentioned and the systemic issues that Pilani spoke about in practice, right? Because I find that very often conversations often become polarized between those who believe Africans, we are the problem, we need to act, we need to do this, and those who think that there are bigger and larger pressures and systemic issues that make it difficult for us as Africans to respect our institutions and act the way we are supposed to do. How do we strike that balance? And if possible, Ambassador Mklapo, from your experience as well as a practitioner, how have you encountered these two polars, and how you have experienced maybe some form of balance? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a reflective question, very important as well. We have to go to the panel now, but there's a very last hand, and I think we'll take it. I know we're under pressure of time, but let's give you the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. As we are engaging in dialogue regarding the peace and security in the continent, how are we going to ensure that gender-based violence is kept at a minimum, or it's completely combated? Which ways, mechanisms, strategies can we bring forth to ensure that there is peace and there's also security, particularly for the up and coming young people, and also the drug problem that we're faced with in this continent.
I'm so glad we gave you the floor because you raised such an important issue. Okay, so we've got a full plate now. Let's start with the ambassador now. I know Ambassador Nhlapo, when he gets the microphone and he's asked penetrating questions, then he reflects deeply. I understand that. But give us the headlines, because maybe over lunch we can also further engage. Yeah. So we'll start with the ambassador, and then we'll go, Cecilia, you know what the questions are, and Pilani, you know what the questions are. They're pretty straightforward.
Yeah, no. Let me start with the first question directed to me. He's taking us back to the question he posed earlier, to the very people that, and I see Ambassador Shu is still here. Is that very same question that we were saying earlier, that we need to have frank and open discussions about the nature of the cooperation that exists and the narrative around it and the nature of the agreements that we signed and how we manage them, because that's what exactly it means. China does not decide, for instance, that we want to, what kind of infrastructure do we want to put in place in any African country. is the countries that say, this is what we want, can you help us? And say, yes, but we want this in return. Right. How do you manage that arrangement? Mutual benefit based on what? There has to be a very clear understanding that it's cooperation that they're talking about, not a question of help us. It's the mentality. If you say help me, I'll do it in my own conditions. If you want me to do it with my own resources, I'll do it. Bring my own labor, bring everything, and give you the stadium or a nice parliament, and then take whatever diamonds, gold, or anything that I need in exchange. Bartering. And then the complications. You are saying future, the challenge is now. And these are the challenges that we have to deal with in the terms of the nature of the cooperation that we have. The question of striking a balance, you know, striking a balance in the first place is that we should be honest about the challenges that we face and develop our own narrative in terms of those challenges. And what should be the solutions? Well, that's where we begin to differ. She spoke of common positions. You take common positions. I'll refer to one that it can be very problematic in some cases. There's a gentleman called Ocampos, who was the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. His term comes to an end. All the cases that we referred to the ICC were investigated and prosecuted by him. I'm saying referred because that's what happened, except for 2. The deputy was Fatu from the Gambia. There were other candidates. We take an African position and we say we are going to fight for this African woman to assume the position. And she did. What did he do? We crucified her. When the meeting of the state parties took place in Uganda, instead of dealing with the issues that we had problems with, she became the problem. But when we were fighting for her to become the prosecutor, at the time we did not remember that she's the prosecutor and she's the one who did some of the investigations that were there in the ICC. Now, with me having dealt with the ICC and Ocampos directly on the issue of Northern Uganda and the IRA, one thing that he had said which has stuck in my mind was that I'm a prosecutor. If I've got a case that I think I'm going to win, you can't tell me to take it off the roll. You can go and tell President Museveni, I'm sorry, you brought the case to us, we investigated it, we're proceeding. And that's what he did as a prosecutor. So sometimes we forget that, you see in the context of that, you say we want a prosecutor to a particular institution that we have a problem with, that we have worked with in our favor, taking those who are opposed to us to them to prosecute, and then say this one must continue, begin to have a problem with that institution, and we say it seems to be focusing on Africans when we are the ones who are taking our people there. And we fight for one of ourselves to be there and crucify her when she's there, doing that work. That's the African position. Then you ask yourself, what was the consideration? What was the interest? It was to push anybody else so that you occupy that position to do what? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Occupy that position to do what? In other instances, we've been able to do that very, very, very meticulously, fought, had our own, supported them, cooperated with them For instance, like Tedros is doing a very good job. He had full African support from the time of his candidature, and his tenure as the WHO and with the pandemic. Africans were proud to have and who supported. That is part of what you call the African position. You take an African position in Addis to the Security Council, and you say the payment, the P3, no, not the AU3, the 3 countries that are representing the continent in the Security Council to run with that common position. And they vote on the basis of their own thinking and position, and at the behest of somebody else who's pressurizing them to vote in a particular way, because if they don't, there's not going to be any budget support. It's blackmail. It has happened now in the Ukraine issue. In the General Assembly, you find people who are absent. We know what happens when people are absent. We're told, you vote this way, we'll deal with you. So they absent themselves to avoid the embarrassment to their peers and those ones who are pushing them. So it's issues like those. It comes back to all the issues that we've been talking about, individual countries, independence, and the strategic sovereignty that Pilano was talking about. So we have to look at those things in a holistic way and see how then we begin to respond and say, where are our weaknesses? What do we do? How do we begin to deal with these issues that are confronting us? Otherwise, we're going to have problems. But let me just end up with one which was not asked. I was not asked. No, the question of AFRICOM. I think it is going to divide us if we are not going to understand what is happening. And the question that was asked, whether South Africa will be willing to host a base. What does that actually mean? You see, the commander of AFRICOM that was here recently, this lady who came from Stuttgart, is from one aspect of AFRICOM, that is the operational angle. And we have to be worried if somebody comes from Stuttgart, from the operational, because there is the other part of AFRICOM that is managed by the Department of Defense, which is military to military cooperation. And we are involved in it ourselves. We've been part of that. So we have to make that distinction, because it's a dilemma that the US have been trying to deal with. How do they decentralize these commands that they have? European Command, Asian Command, African Command. Most of them were under one command, that is the European Command. How do they decentralize? Take AFRICOM, the component, put it in Africa. Like the others, you were able to deploy them in the regions where they are supposed to be responsible. Here it became a bit of a difficult situation. There was opposition. So there's this decision that we have got to continuously make. And in terms of the dilemma of the US in terms of how to deal with what they call their vital security interests in this continent, and how they then force this kind of cooperation to make sure that they have a presence that is in their interest. But you'll always have to understand, recently, they've taken a decision that those who perished when their embassy was attacked in Kenya are not going to get any compensation. And who are those? Kenyans.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much for those questions. So I'll go straight to the question on women. Do we have women that are making a difference? So I think to understand that question, I think we also need to unpack the involvement of women and their contribution to addressing issues of peace and security within the context in which they are operating. So I think the examples that I would give, the question, do we have those women? My question would be yes. We need to be looking into those spaces where women are making those contributions and telling their story. So for example, I've worked a lot on examining what is going on within the Southern African Development Community and the role that women who are organizing within the regional context are doing, both in terms of contributing to the issues of peace and security, how they organize outside the SADC space to influence policy within SADC itself. So when you look at the norms on gender that that constitutes the SADC, or that define the SADC in terms of the gender agenda, you find that women have been greatly involved organizing outside the SADC space in order to provide input on issues of women and security, as well as when you look at the involvement of women from the SADC region in providing input in the Sustainable Development Goals. There was that big role because women have realized that they need to be in those spaces. They need to provide input at a regional level as well as at the global level. So in terms of women's participation, there is evidence and examples of their active involvement. But this is also not to romanticize that these spaces have been easy for women. It's been a struggle to push for the ideas or the policies. For example, when one tracks the process of coming up with first the SADC gender protocol, this was not an easy journey for women, but what did help were the solidarity networks of women organizing outside the SADC space in order to provide input into the SADC Declaration on Gender. And we also see the same challenges that women engaging with state actors within the SADC processes. So that is not only peculiar to the SADC region, but we've also seen it in other regions. These have not been smooth spaces for women. They've had to push very hard to be heard and also to sit on that table to input on issues that affect them. So that's on the point of women. And also when we look at the peacekeeping missions, we have women that are part of the peacekeeping missions. Okay. And on the issue of quiet diplomacy, I think that's a very important point that you raise, and I'll definitely look at it in terms of revising my paper. I want to point out that, for example, when we're talking about the conflict in Zimbabwe that led to the power sharing agreement, while the story of the role that Thabo Mbeki played and other state actors in that conflict, there's very little mention on the role that the church, civil society, and many actors in Zimbabwe played towards facilitating or their input in that power sharing agreement. So when the story is told, it's told at that level, but we don't hear the stories. And I say so because at that point I was working in Zimbabwe for an organization called Center for Peace. So there was quite a lot of input from non-state actors in that process, in that quite diplomacy process. But when the story is told, most of the time the focus is on what happened at the top level to reach that agreement. Thank you.
No, very, very good point. And I think that also tells us about, I think Ambassador Nhlapo also mentioned about sort of owning our narratives. And I think, you know, the point you mentioned, I think we do have to tell our own stories, you know. We really have to tell our own stories, because if we don't, yeah, you have, you know, well, forgetfulness, but also you also don't have recognition. I think recognition is important because it also sends a message to subsequent generations. I mean, you mentioned youth, women, and you know, we do this sometimes even when we talk about the, you know, Pan-Africanism, and we talk about the institutions of Pan-Africanism. We speak about the founding fathers, you know, and we don't always acknowledge that the Pan-African Women's Organization was formed before
62.
the Organization for African Unity. So Ambassador Nhlapo just said 1962. Right? And we know the OAU was formed in 63. This was a Pan-African, you know, this is institution building. So when we talk about the story of Pan-Africanism and institution building on the continent, it very much goes to this question that you mentioned. And it also goes to the question of youth. I mean, we look at the people who are leading some of these initiatives. At the time, you know, these were young people, but also even now, I mean, I think at times we still say Africa is the future, but at times I find myself, or we say young people are the future. Sometimes I sort of question that, and I say, I mean, it's true, of course it's true, but I'm just, you know, sometimes thinking at a conceptual level, it's more about, in our continent, it's not even that young people are the future. I mean, like 70% or so of Africans are under the age of 30. I mean, can you imagine that? Under the age of 30. That's I mean, by far a majority of the people on our continent. So can we afford for them to be the future and not be, you know, really active now, but also having the platforms to be active, not having to, you know, always fight for your space to be active. You know, I think even when we think about people that we continue to learn from, I mean, even, you know, people like Ambassador Nhlapo, when they were, you know, sort of working on a lot of areas around international relations, and these were young people, you know, but had the space and also had the leadership to basically throw them in the deep end and say, learn quickly, you know, go to that international conference and represent us over there, you know, and learn on your feet. So we need that, you know, also now. And I think, you know, just maybe the last point, I think, yes, I agree. I mean, you mentioned, you know, we have to look at how, you know, Africa has to unite, and it's not, you know, for me, I mean, you mentioned Russia, and I mean, I was recently there at the Russia-Africa summit, and one of the things that I made mention of is because obviously the Russia, you know, made an announcement that you know, it's obviously out of the Black Sea grain deal now, and it sort of presented its own alternative. There's certain countries, both through commercial and non-commercial means, that it would extend grain to. And you know, one of the issues I mentioned was that, yeah, that's good, that's important, you know, that's very important. But what's more important for Africa is to think that 20 years ago, Russia was a net importer of food. It's a net exporter now of food, exports 20% of the world's grains. Now, we have all the conditions on the continent to be able to do that, you know? we've got all the conditions to be able to do that, to become an exporter of food and to really feed ourselves. And so one of the things they're saying is, yes, we welcome initiatives that obviously will alleviate food security, issues on the continent. But what's more in our interest is to work with, external actors, whether it's Russia, whether it's Europeans, whether it's the US, that they invest here, produce here with, with local actors. And that is what over time builds up our own material resources and builds up our capacity to be able to actually defend our positions. If you can feed yourself, you have a stronger voice, if you can protect yourself, you have a stronger voice also. So that becomes quite important going forward. And then my last, sort of contribution is just, someone mentioned the issue of justice. I think recently South Africa extended an award or an honor, one of the national sort of honors, to a late artist, Peter Tosh. Yeah. So Peter Tosh addresses the issue of equal rights and justice, in one of his songs. I would sing if I got backup music, but Anthony can back me up. But, it basically says everyone is crying about peace, but none is crying out for justice. And he says there will not be, any peace, until man as in mankind has equal rights and justice. So clearly, it goes back to, you do have to address issues of justice. If you're not addressing those issues, you're just entering cycles of, calm and then eruptions, calm and eruptions. So you do have to address those issues of justice.
On that point, let me just say, on the point of justice, you were mentioning Lesotho and Swazi claims for land. It's a quest for justice. You can't democratize Lesotho or find a balance between the monarchy and democracy in Eswatini if you don't also address the question of justice. People are crying out for justice in those mini states, our immediate neighbors. So it's a big issue. You wanted to add something before I wrap up?
Yeah, no. Just last week, it was announced that the AU Commission, I don't know on what basis, took a decision to rescind the Commission of Inquiry into the atrocities that had been committed in Ethiopia-Tigray conflict. That's the justice on the continent. I thought maybe that's what prompted the question. This is the direction in which we're drifting.
Yeah. And this thing of youth.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. The APRM, just recently, a couple of years ago, launched one of their annual reports. And I happened to be there. Eddie Maloka. Eddie, make the youth involved in the business of the APRM. Yes, Chief, no problem. Then they have a launch, big budget launch. They invited the youth. They were sitting at the back of the hall to be the audience. And in front were these dignitaries from the APRM. They were all 70 years old and older. And the youth stood up in that meeting and said, no, you've put us at the back. When you claim in your speeches that we are the future, what is wrong with you? Yes, they were taught a lesson there, but they are not listening. My advice to the youth, stand up and claim your space. If you want the AU or the PAP or the APRM and so on to do it for you, political and ruling elites are not interested because you are possibly a threat. You ask difficult questions. Okay, so allow me to give you 7 takeaways from all of this conversation. The first one is peace diplomacy. You know what that is? Remember I asked him to start there, the ambassador. The art and science of building and maintaining peaceful relations between peoples and nations. Isn't that a nice sort of definition? We must apply it. And when we apply it in our African setting, I would say the purpose of peace diplomacy is to reach that vision of the Agenda 2063. A united, stable, prosperous, integrated Africa with a global voice. And if peace diplomacy must play that role to reach that vision, it must speak to 3 imperatives. It's the growth and development imperative. It is the peace and security and justice imperative. And it's the state building and good governance imperative. If it touches those 3, then we will know peace diplomacy is playing the role that it's meant to. In that context, that's the first point. The second one, to what extent are we able to identify the root causes of conflict? You know, as an academic, Cecilia, maybe you will also know, or Pilani, when we source textbooks, they come from the North, the global North. So to what extent can we identify the root causes of conflict? Can we design our own solutions? Can we design our own? To what extent are we doing that? So a very critical question. Is APSA fit for purpose? Because now we've designed a solution. Now, is it fit for purpose? It's a critical question that is emerging not only amongst academics. The third one, if we can't do this, design our own solutions, you know that others do it for us. And what are the consequences of not having a peace and security agenda that is set by ourselves but co-determined or set by others, foreign powers? What are the consequences of that? And what are the challenges that arises because of that? And if Kwesi Anding from Kofi Annan was here, Ambassador, he probably, if he was frank with us, would say, we are training peacekeepers. We're doing peacekeeping training at Kofi Annan. But our budget comes from?
That's the problem.
From Europeans. It's a challenge. How do we overcome that? And we shouldn't laugh at West Africa or elsewhere. We should ask here in SADC, who's paying for our training? Including training women as mediators. I mean, where's the code? They have the experience. If Andrea was here, she would have enlightened us. It's a dilemma. It creates opportunities, but also closes down other challenges or avenues. The next thing is, number 4, this new agenda for peace that comes out of the UN by Guterres. I wonder if you've read it. New Agenda for Peace. It's worth reading. Does that document meet our expectations? And if not, what are we going to do about it? Number 5, let me be critical of Agenda 2063. It was written by, when Nkosazana was chairing the commission, and we know more or less how that came about and so on. Agenda 2063, it was good then. What has happened in the meantime is COVID-19 and Ukraine. And the world order is changing in front of our eyes. Should we adjust Agenda 2063 or just live with it? Or how do we deal with that? And I think maybe the second last question is on peace diplomacy. The ambassador asked, what are the challenges that require solutions? I mean, that phrase is now lingering in my mind. What are the challenges that require solutions? It's a difficult question to ask, and I'll tell you why I'm raising it now. Because I think my last point is this: what are the roles of universities? Professor Mello, what is it that you think UNISA should do about the things that we are discussing here? Or us with our partners, IGD, Rhodes, Accord, and others? What is the role of intellectuals and academics? Is it for us just to analyze? Is it to help provide solutions? Is it to capacitate and train and educate? I think it's a little bit of all of them. But have we worked out a Pan-African approach as academics to help our brothers and sisters who sit in these institutions, to help them govern and manage conflict and resolve it better? There are regional institutions and associations of academics. I think you know that. And Kodesria is a very good example. But I'm not aware of a continental one, a Pan-African one. I was saying in jest earlier that we must write our own international relations textbook. Cecilia, you must write that by a way of speaking for our own students to change the narrative. And I mean it when I say that the time has arrived for us to do that again. It's the beginning of what academics can do. And UNISA must play a role with partners, Turkeys and many others on the continent. Thank you very much. I'm handing over back to the organizers. And maybe a round of applause for our panelists.
Colleagues, esteemed guests, thank you for engaging so robustly and so informatively. But again, my sincere thanks to the guests that were able to make it to the discussion and to provide such thought-provoking and incisive answers on some of the questions you had asked, which were very difficult. In fact, I still feel unsatisfied because I still feel a lot of them were playing diplomatic games with our minds on these concepts. But fair enough, because these are difficult questions to answer, and to answer them in ways that can appeal to as many people as possible. But that said, I want to just quickly elaborate on the outcome of these discussions and the products that will come out of these discussions. The vision here was to do exactly what Professor Van Niekerk alluded to, which was to produce something that would reflect our visions, our strategic understanding of the conversations we're having, and not just to have it at an ivory tower level, so to speak, but to ground it in the realities of the problems we're facing today, tomorrow, and in the future. And this is in context of a global arena of conflict and mediation and engagement. So the working title, for example, reflects this global relevance, being the role of external actors in peace and security engagement in Africa. Because this is a topic now that is now most relevant to how we respond and adapt and engage the global audience and society at large. So the one thing was to produce a text that reflects these conversations, that is overarching. So for those who don't know, we are going to be reaching out to academics from the global south. For example, Brazil, China, India, and Russia. Or Russia technically is part of the global north, but part of the BRICS environment, so that it incorporates a so-called global perspective on our ideas. And by doing this, we're going to begin narratives or shift narratives towards our strategic, or for our strategic interests as a collective, and build our understanding and our appreciation of what we are as a society. So this is the key takeaway from this, an edited volume. And our participants here will represent some of these contributions. There will be other participants or contributions which I'm working on, or we are working on as a team. The second output, or just as important, is the conference report, which, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Sipho Sitle Gomede, who is my PhD student, but also the lead rapporteur for this event, and she's going to do a stellar job of putting together the conversations of these past 2 days. And this will be the first report that will come out for the general consumption and reading by our audience. So in essence, we have two outputs from this event, which would hopefully give us fuel to take on some of these debates and conversations and produce literature that is relevant to all of us going forward. But on that note, I want to thank you for all contributing to this discussion and actually provoking thought for our panelists to strengthen their contributions so that they can lead us strategically into a future that we are in control of and desire. Colleagues, thank you very much for attending and for availing yourselves for this process. Thank you. Sincere thanks. I will also want to thank Ms. Gomede for putting this conference report together in advance. Thank you. I hand over the duties of thanks and closing of the event to Prof. Nello.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. Maybe let me start by acknowledging the people who put together this dialogue and a symposium, and Kwesi was one of them. Some of the people are not here, but this is basically a culmination of a cooperation. The power of the cooperation and collaboration of different entities. His department, Department of History, the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, ACOT, individuals who are coming from different institutions as well. We must not forget the ladies and gentlemen who sit outside, those who are sitting behind laptops right at the back there, who are ensuring that we can talk to somebody who is in China. Those are very critical people that we always have to acknowledge when we have conferences. Yesterday we had a panel, and Ambassador Nhlapo was there, did a very sterling job. Today we had two-part type of panels. The first part focused on China, and we had our colleagues, including the ambassador for China, who also gave us their perspective. And this afternoon, or the mid-morning to the afternoon, we had again a collection of brilliant minds in as far as international relations are concerned. Ambassador Nhlapo was still there. Cecilia was there to give us a very insightful perspective in as far as Africa is concerned. Pilani, you also came in with your brilliant mind in terms of giving your own perspective. Again, as you look at the contribution of all these people, including the moderator, who is my colleague, Anthony from the TM School, when you look at what and you listen to what they are saying, you're perhaps saying maybe this dialogue should have been linked to all the politicians in Africa because they needed to hear what we are saying here. But I'm much more glad that there is going to be an output. There is going to be a report that is going to be put together. And ultimately, it means that whatever we are discussing in this room is going to leave this room, is going to be read by other people, and hopefully those people are going to take action in as far as making sure that Africa becomes the winner. Because in all this confusion, we need development, we need success. The youth that you're talking about, that you're saying that are in the majority, they need to see a much more brighter future. And it is the politicians, it is us, the academics, it is us, the civil society, who must make sure that we have an even brighter future. And with those few words, I just want to say thank you, all of you, including the audience, for all the toughest questions that you have asked. Some of them I could see that they were unsettling people, but that's the nature of the dialogue. We don't always have to ask questions that are easy to answer. Thank you very much. I believe lunch is served outside. And please clap hands for yourselves.
Thanks for that thing on Zimbabwe. You know, this is what is worrying all the time, and which is what we've been saying. And particularly when you involve heads of state, sitting heads of state, former heads of state, ministers, or whoever, because of that time, everything start focusing and reflecting on that.